Alrighty, sorry about the delay. Got held up a little. But I'm back. Hi! So yeah, welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we're going to keep reading from Behemoth, Book 2, Seppuku, by Peter Watts. So previously on, Lubin is still out cleaning up um, business from all the people that they had to spread this seppuku gunk around, and got into an altercation with someone who took way too much effort to deal with. Fong, I think his name was. Anyway, so some slight doubts creeping into Lubin, being like, "Man, this was way too much work. I hope I'm not losing my edge." I I knew I had lost a little because I'd been underwater for 5 years, but I didn't really think I had lost that much of an edge. So he's mulling that one over. Ricketts, sadly, has passed. He was a nice guy. You have to feel kind of some pity for him, being hopelessly enthralled by Lennie, being this exotic personage. But he figures out that indeed Lennie is the Lennie of the Lennies, the Shredders, the Madonnas, who who have become just outright violent. They'll shred each other. They'll shred anything. But at her behest, he tweaked the captive Lennie that they had, not Lenie Clarke, but the digital program cyberfauna, and made it so that it has kin selection traits, basically. So if it finds another Lennie, it will not attack it unless attacked first. And we already had a nice little example of how that particular trait would spread, and it did. And so the paradigm on the Webernets is shifting for the people of the Rifters universe. For the better, for the worse, who knows? We'll find out, won't we? Let's see. Taka is having a bad time because she's, in Achilles Desjardins' claws, and he has predilections, shall we say, of, torture and abuse. He's not a nice person. Um, there'll be a bit more of that this week. I think we're past most of the worst of it, um, but there is, it's not great. It's pretty unpleasant. As another casual reminder, the views exhibited by the fictional characters in the work of fiction do not necessarily reflect the views and predilections of the narrator or the person who wrote it. Just the fictional characters in the work of fiction. So, in case that is a difficult concept to grasp for some, there's this thing called the real world that we live in. And then you have a practically infinite number of fictional created worlds in works of fiction, such as a novel or a TV show or a movie. And those people in that, or a video game, those people in that aren't actually people. And I'm not saying this to diminish their realness, but they are um, pale facsimiles of people, and they're not real people. They're made up, not real. The things that happen to them aren't real either. Sometimes sometimes this is difficult to grasp. I shouldn't have to say any of that, but we're doing it just in case. I haven't been dinged yet, although I haven't honestly looked in a while. But if I were to get dinged, this is the stuff that would do it. Anyway, that'll about do it for us. Let me just get a quick sip of water here. Maybe several sips, perhaps a gulp. And then today's probably going to be a shorter one. And yeah, maybe not that short. So part of the difficulty is I do want to fit in the afterword that he has because Peter Watts has fairly fascinating afterwords. Um, they tell you kind of this is the stuff I was looking at. These are where my ideas were. And that's fairly meaty, but not that meaty. How long is this Bastille chapter right at the end? Oh, yeah, no, that's like the 20 pager. Yeah, no. So it's either this one winds up being a little short or next week's winds up being extremely short, like, I don't know, half an hour long. So I'm going to go with this one will be a little short, like 15 to 30 minutes shorter than usual. And we'll deal with it accordingly. Okay. I think that's it for me. Oh, right. The bit of artwork here is by Deep Space KSW from 2021. And Peter Watts says the following. You may have run into Deep Space KSW's work over in the Blindopraxia wing. These sketches are a lot simpler, more doodles than finished works, but they do evoke some cool moments. And with that, we'll get cracking. Sorry, one last aside before we get cracking. I just want to give a big shout out to all the people who keep posting the timestamps for these when I start actually reading and all that. Your efforts are immensely appreciated. Thank you. You know who you are. Everyone else should too. Thank you. Toggle. It had only been a matter of time, Lubin knew. Word of mouth was a fission reaction when the meme was strong enough, even on a landscape where the mouths themselves had been virtually eradicated. If that boy on his bike hadn't left a trail of contamination on his way into town, there could have been others. Evidently, there had been. His ultralight cruised 100 meters above the scarred patchwork brown of post-witch New England. The eastern sky was black with smoke, great dark pillars billowing up from the other side of a shaved rocky ridge just ahead. It was the same ridge from which they'd watched the stars fall, the same ridge that Lubin and Clarke had traversed on their way to meet Desjardins' botfly. Back then, the fire had been on this side of the hill, a tiny thing, really, a flickering corral intended only to imprison. Now, all of Freeport was in flames. Oh no, not LL Bean. Two lifters hung low in the sky, barely above the ridge's spine. The smoke roiled about them, obscuring or exposing their outlines at the whim of the updraft. They still spewed occasional streams of fire at the ground, but it must have been mere afterthought. From the looks, oh my god, these shorter lines are killing me. From the looks of it, they'd already be. They'd. Okay, let's try the paragraph from the top. I'm sorry, guys. And Goyles, guys and guyettes. Uh, and everything and everyone in between. Now all of Freeport was in flames. Two lifters hung low in the sky, barely above the ridge's spine. The smoke roiled about them, obscuring or exposing their outlines at the whim of the updraft. They still spewed occasional streams of fire at the ground, but it must have been mere afterthought. From the looks of it, they'd already completed their task. Now Lubin had to do his. Clarke was safe, surely. The lifters could scorch the sky and the earth and even the surface of the sea, but they wouldn't be able to reach anything lurking on the bottom. Facina was invisible and untouchable. Afterwards, when the flames had died down, he would come back and check on her. In the meantime, he had a perimeter to patrol. He'd come in from the west, along Dyer Road. There'd been no outgoing traffic. Now he banked south, bypassing the firestorm on a vector that would intercept I-95. The lifters had approached from the north. Any refugees with wheeled transportation would most likely be fleeing in the opposite direction. Maybe one of them would give him an excuse. 13 kilometers down the track, he got a hit on long-range motion. It was a heavy return, almost a truck, but it dropped off the scope just a few seconds after acquisition. He climbed and did a lateral sweep at 150. That netted him 2 intermittent contacts in quick succession. Then nothing. It was enough. The target had deked east off the highway and disappeared into ground clutter, but he had a fix on the last hit. With any luck, those coordinates would lie on a side road without too many intersections. With any luck, the target was down to a single degree of freedom. For once, luck was with him. The road was a winding thing, obscured by the tangled, overreaching arms of dying trees that would have hidden it completely in greener days. Those branches were still thick enough to scramble any clear view of a moving object, but they couldn't hide it entirely. At its current speed, the target would reach the coast in a few minutes. The ocean sparkled in the distance, a flat blue expanse picketed by rows of ivory spires. From here, those spires were the size of toothpicks. In fact, each stood 100 meters tall. Trifoliate rotors spun lazily atop some, each slender blade as long as a 10-story building. On others, the rotors were frozen in place, or missing a foil. A few had been entirely decapitated. Some kind of industrial complex nestled amongst the staggered feet of the windmills, a floating sprawl of pipes and scaffolds in spherical reservoirs. Coarse details resolved as Lubin neared the coast. A hydrogen cracking station, probably feeding Portland a discreet 15 or 20 clicks to the south. It was dwarfed by distance and the structures that powered it, although it was easily several stories tall. Over the water now. Behind him, the road broke free of the necrotic forest and curved smoothly along the coast. It ended at a little spill of asphalt that bled out and congealed into a parking lot overlooking the ocean. No way out except the way in. Lubin banked back and down into position as the target emerged from cover and passed beneath him. It was Miri. I might have known, he thought. I never could trust that woman to stay put. He dropped down over the road and stalled a couple of meters up, letting the ground effectors set him down near the entrance to the lot. The MI idled silently before him, windows dark, doors closed, weapons blister retracted. A sign on a nearby guardrail played sponsored animations of a view from better days. Across the water, the wind farm turned its tattered blades in the breeze. It had to be Clarke at the wheel. Lubin had watched Willette recode the lock, and she'd only authorized the 3 of them to drive. On the other hand, they'd disabled the cab's internal intruder defenses. It was possible, albeit unlikely, that Clarke was driving with a gun to her head. He'd landed right beside the embankment that sloped to the shoreline. That was cover, if he needed it. He got out of the ultralight, ready to hit the dirt. He was at the far edge of Miri's diagnostic emanations. Her virtual guts flickered disconcertingly in and out of view. He killed his inlays and the distraction. The MI's driver door, swung open. Lenie Clarke climbed out. He met her halfway. Her eyes were naked and brimming. "Oh, God, Ken, did you see?" He nodded. "I knew those people. I tried to help them. I know it was pointless, but I—" He had only seen her like this once. He had only seen her like this once before. He wondered, absurdly, if he should put his arms around her, if that would provide some sort of comfort. It seemed to work with other people sometimes, but Lenie Clarke and Ken Lubin had always been too close for that kind of display. "You know it's necessary," he reminded her. She shook her head. "No, Ken, it never was." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why do you say that?" She glanced back at the MI. Instantly, Lubin's guard snapped up. "Who's with you?" he asked in a low voice. "Who's with you?" he asked in a low voice. Much better. "Ricketts," she told him. "Rick—" He remembered. "No." She nodded. "He came back? You didn't call for containment?" He shook his head, appalled. "Len, do you know what you—" "I know," she said with no trace of regret. "Indeed. Then you realize that in all likelihood Freeport was burned because you—" "No," she said. "He's a vector." He stepped around her. She blocked him. "You're not touching him, Ken." "I'm surprised I even have to. He should have been dead days ago." "I'm being an idiot," he realized. "What do you know?" he asked. "I know he's got incipient seppuku, sweating, fever, flushed skin, elevated metabolism." "Go on." "I know that a few days ago he had advanced seppuku." "Meaning?" "So weak he could barely move. Had to feed on an IV. He had to use a saccadal keyboard to even talk." "He's getting better," Lubin said skeptically. "Seppuku's below 10 to the second, and dropping by the hour. That's why I brought him back to Miri in the first place. Facina doesn't have the—" "You kept him in Facina," Lubin said in a dead monotone. "You can spank me later, okay? Just shut up and listen. I took him back to Miri and I ran every test she knew how to recommend, and they all confirmed it. 3 days ago he was absolutely on death's door, and today I've seen worse head colds." "You have a cure?" He couldn't believe it. "He doesn't need a cure. It cures itself. You just get over it." "I'd like to see those data." "You can do more than that. You can help collect them. We were just about to run the latest sequence when the lifters showed up." Lubin shook his head. "Taka seemed to think—" But Taka Willette, by her own admission, had fouled up before. Taka Willette was nowhere near the top of her field. And Taka Willette had discovered Seppuku's dark side only after Achilles Desjardins had led her on his own guided tour of the data. "I've been trying to figure out why anyone would create a bug that builds to absolutely massive concentrations in the body and then just dies off," Clarke said. "And I can only come up with one reason." She cocked her head at him. "How many vectors did you catch?" 18. Working day and night. Working night and day, tracking pink clouds and heat traces, taking directions from anonymous voices on the radio, derms pasted on his skin to scrub the poisons from his blood. Keep him going on. He actually uses proper. Oh God, that's the wrong tube. Proper notation here. Note to self: you don't have gills. Okay. 18. Working night and day, tracking pink clouds and heat traces, taking directions from anonymous voices on the radio, derms pasted on his skin to scrub the poisons from his blood, keep him going on half an hour's sleep out of every 24. "Any of them die?" Clarke asked. "I was told they died in quarantine." He snorted at his own stupidity. What does it take to fool the master? Just 5 years out of the game and a voice on the airwaves.
Taka was right, as far as she went, Clarke said. Seppuku would kill if nothing stopped it. She just didn't realize that Seppuku stopped itself somehow, and she's got some kind of esteem issues. Imagine that, Lubin thought dryly. She's so used to being the fuck-up that she just assumes she fucked up at the slightest excuse. She stared at Lubin with a face holding equal parts hope and horror. But she was right all along, Ken. We're back at square one. Someone must have figured out how to beat Behemoth, and someone else is trying to stop them. Desjardins, Lubin said. Clarke hesitated. Maybe. There was no maybe about it. Achilles Desjardins was too high in the ranks not to know of any campaign to rehabilitate the continent. Ergo, he couldn't possibly have not known Seppuku's true nature. He had simply lied about it. And Clarke was wrong about something else, too. They weren't back to square one at all. Back on square one, Lubin had not invested 2 weeks fighting for the wrong side. Wrong. He didn't like that word. It didn't belong in his vocabulary. It evoked woolly-minded dichotomies like good and evil. Every clear-minded being knew that there was no such thing. There was only what worked and what didn't. More effective and less. The disloyalty of a friend may be maladaptive, but it is not bad. The overtures of a potential ally may serve mutual interest, but that does not make them good. Even hating the mother who beats you as a child is to utterly miss the point. Nobody chooses the wiring in their brain. Anyone else's, wired the same, would spark as violently. Ken Lubin could fight any enemy to the death without malice. He could switch sides the moment circumstances warranted. So it wasn't that the creators of Seppuku were right and Achilles Desjardins was wrong, necessarily. It was simply that Ken Lubin had been misled as to which side he was on. He'd spent his whole life being used, but to be used without his knowledge was not something he was willing to forgive. Something ticked over in him then, a kind of toggle between pragmatism and dedication. The latter setting afforded him a certain focus, although it had undeniably led to some maladaptive choices in the past. He used it sparingly. He used it now. Desjardins. It had been him all along, behind the fires, behind the anti-missiles, behind the misdirection. Desjardins. Achilles Desjardins. Playing him. If that's not an excuse, he reflected, nothing is. Lubin's ultralight had been a gift from Desjardins. It would be a good idea to continue the conversation at a farther remove. Lubin took Clarke by the arm and walked her to the MI. She didn't resist. Maybe she'd seen him flip the switch. She got in the driver's side. He got in the passenger's. Ricketts crouched in the back. His complexion was slightly flushed, his forehead damp, but he was sitting up, and he was munching a protein brick with obvious enthusiasm. "Hi again," he said. "'Member me?" Lubin turned to Clarke. "He's still a lawbreaker. His infrastructure isn't what it used to be, but he's still got plenty of resources, and nobody further up appears to be reining him in." "I know," Clarke said. "He could have us under surveillance right now." Hey, if you're worried about the big guys listening in," Ricketts said around a mouthful of chewy aminos, "I wouldn't worry about it. They're going to have, other things on their minds any moment." Lubin gave him a cold look. "What are you talking about?" "He's right, actually," Clarke said. "Someone's about to lose control of their—" A soft blatting sound cut her off, like the muffled explosion of distant artillery. "Outer demons," she finished, but Lubin was already back outside. Off across the water, in the spindly shadows of a decrepit wind farm, the hydrogen cracking station was burning. It was as though, in that instant, they had changed places. Clarke was suddenly advocating non-interference. Ken, we're two people. One person. I'm doing this solo. Doing what exactly? There's a rogue in Sierra. Let Sierra handle him. There's got to be some way to get a message overseas. I intend to, assuming we can access an overseas line, but I have doubts that it will do any good. We can transmit from Facina. Lubin shook his head. We know there's at least one rogue at large. We don't know how many others he might be working with. There's no guarantee that any message routed through a West Hem node would even get through, even, he glanced at the conflagration across the water, before this. So we move offshore. We could drive across the ocean and hand-deliver the memo ourselves if we... And if it did, he continued, unsubstantiated claims that Axira Lawbreaker was even capable of going rogue will be treated with extreme skepticism in a world where the existence of Spartacus is not widely known. Ken, by the time we convinced them to take us seriously, and by the time that overseas forces had mustered a response, Desjardins would have escaped. The man is far from stupid. So let him escape. As long as he isn't blocking Seppuku anymore, what harm can he do? She was dead wrong, of course. There was no end to the harm Desjardins could do in the course of abandoning the board. He might even cause Lubin to fail in his mission, and there was no way in hell he was going to permit that. Ken Lubin had never been much for introspection. He had to wonder, though, if Clarke's doubts might not have a grain of truth to them. It would be so much easier to simply make the call and stand back. And yet, the desire to inflict violence had grown almost irresistible, and the rules were only as strong as the person who made them. So far, Lubin had more or less remained true to his code, minor lapses like Fong notwithstanding. But in the face of this new outrage, he didn't know how much civilization was left in him. He was royally pissed, and he really needed to take it out on someone. Perhaps, at least, he could choose a target who actually had it coming. And away we go. Time to start building for a climax, folks. Fleas. She could barely remember a time when she hadn't bled. It seemed as though she'd spent her whole life on her knees, trapped in a diabolical exoskeleton that bent and stretched in arbitrary excess of anything the human body could mimic. Her body didn't have a choice, had never had a choice. The dancing cage it took along The dancing cage took it along for a ride, posed her like some hyperextensible doll in a chorus line. Her joints popped apart and back together like the pieces of some ill-fitted cartilaginous puzzle. She'd lost her right breast an eternity ago. Achilles had looped some kind of freak-wire noose around it and just pulled. It had plopped onto the Escher tiles like a dead fish. She remembered, hoping at the time, that maybe she'd bleed to death, but she'd never had the chance. He'd ground some flat-faced iron of searing metal against her chest, cauterized the wound. Back then, she'd still had it in her to scream. For some time now, she'd inhabited a point halfway between her body and the ceiling, some interface between hell and anesthesia conjured up out of pure need. She could look down and observe the atrocities being inflicted on her flesh with something almost approaching dispassion. She could feel the pain, but it was becoming an abstract thing, like a reading on a gauge. Sometimes, when the torture stopped, she would slide back into her own flesh and take stock of the damage firsthand. Even then, agony was becoming more tiresome than painful. And through it all wound the insane tutorials, the endless, absurd questions about chiral catalysts and hydroxyl intermediates and cross-nucleotide duplexing, the punishments and amputations that followed wrong answers, the blessed, merely intolerable rapes that followed the right ones. She realized that she no longer had anything left to lose. Achilles took her chin in hand and lifted her head up to the light. "Good morning, Alice. Ready for today's lesson?"
Fuck you,
she croaked. He kissed her on the mouth.
"Only if you pass the daily quiz. Otherwise, I'm afraid
I'm not taking... A sudden racking cough spoiled the impact of her defiance a bit, but she pressed on.
I'm not taking your fucking quiz. You might as well cut to the chase while you've still got the chance."
He stroked her cheek. "Bit of an adrenaline rush going on, have we?"
"They'll find out about you eventually, and then they'll..."
He actually laughed at that.
"What makes you think they don't already know?"
She swallowed and told herself, "No." Achilles straightened, letting her head drop.
"How do you know I'm not already broadbanding this to every wristwatch in the hemisphere? Do you really think the world's in any position to begrudge me your head on a stick with all the good I'm doing?"
"Good," Taka whispered. She would have laughed.
"Do you know how many lives I save when I'm not in here trying to give you a decent education? Thousands. On a bad day. Whereas I go through a bit of ass candy like you maybe once a month. Anyone who shut me down would have orders of more blood on their hands than I ever could on mine."
She shook her head.
"It's not like that." "Like what, ass candy?" "Don't care how many you save. Doesn't give you the right to..."
"Oh, man, it's not just biology, is it? Tell me, is there anything you're not as dumb as a sack of shit about?"
"I'm right. You know it."
"Do I? You think we should go back to the good old days when the corpses were running things? The smallest multicorp killed more people than all the sex killers who ever lived for a fucking profit margin. And the WTO gave them awards for it." He spat. The spittle made a foamy little amoeba on the floor. "Nobody cares, sweetmeat. And if they did, you'd be even worse off, because they'd realize that I'm an improvement."
"You're wrong,"
she managed. "Ooh," Achilles said. "Insubordination. Gets me hot. Excuse me." He stepped back behind the stocks and swung the assembly around. Taka spun smoothly in her harness until she was facing him again. He was holding a pair of alligator clips, though their wires draped down to an electrical outlet embedded in the eye of a sky-blue fish. "Tell you what," he proposed. "You find a flaw in my argument, and I won't use these."
"Yeah," she rasped. "You will."
"No, I won't. Promise. Try me." She reminded herself. Nothing to lose.
"You think people will see this and then just walk away when you tell them the courses are worse? You think people are logical? You're the one with shit for brains. They won't care about your fucking argument. They'll take one look and they'll tear you to pieces. The only reason you can get away with it now is..."
That's it, she realized. What would happen if Behemoth just went away? What would happen if the apocalypse receded a bit? If the situation grew just a little less desperate? Perhaps, in a safer world, people would go back to pretending they were civilized. Perhaps they wouldn't be quite so willing to pontificate on the unaffordability of human rights. Perhaps Achilles Desjardins would lose his amnesty. That's why you're fighting Seppuku, she whispered. Achilles tapped the alligator clips together. They sparked.
Sorry, what was that?
You are so full of shit. Saving thousands? There are people trying to save the world, and you're trying to stop them. You're killing billions. You're killing everyone. So you can get away with this.
He shrugged. Well, it's like I tried to explain to Alice the first. When someone steals your conscience, you have a really hard time giving a shit.
You'll lose. You don't run the world, you only run this piece of it. You can't keep Seppuku out forever.
Achilles nodded thoughtfully.
I know, but don't worry your pretty little head about it. I've already planned for my retirement. You have other concerns.
He pushed her head down against the stocks, stretching her neck. He kissed her nape.
Like, for example, the fact that you're late for class. Let's see. Yesterday we were talking about the origin of life, as I recall, and how some might think that Behemoth had evolved on the same tree that we did, and it took a while, but you eventually remembered why those people had their heads up their asses. And that was because...
She hadn't forgotten. Behemoth's pyranosal pyranosal RNA, pyranosal, none he knew. Let's try that again. She hadn't forgotten. Behemoth's pyranosal RNA couldn't crosstalk with modern nucleic acids. There'd be no way for one template to evolve into the other. But right now, there was no way in this hell that she was going to bark on command. She clenched her jaw and kept silent. Of course, it didn't bother him a bit.
Well then, let's just do the review exercises, shall we?
Her body spun back into position. The assembly locked into place. The exoskeleton drew back her arms, spread her legs. She felt herself cracking open like a wishbone. She vacated the premises, pushed her consciousness back into that perfect little void where pain and hope and Achilles Desjardins didn't exist. Far beneath her, almost underwater, she felt her body moving back and forth to the rhythm of his thrusting. She couldn't feel him in her, of course. She'd been spoiled by all the battering rams he'd used to pave the way. She found that vaguely amusing for reasons she couldn't quite pin down. She remembered Dave and the time he'd surprised her on the patio. She remembered live theater in Boston. She remembered Crystal's 4th birthday. Strange sounds followed her through from the other world, rhythmic sounds, faintly ridiculous in context. Someone was singing down there, an inane little ditty rendered off key while her distant body got the gears.
So, naturalists observe a flea has smaller fleas that on him prey, and these have smaller still to bite 'em, and so proceed ad infinitum.
There had to be a subtext, of course. There would be a quiz at the end of class. Only there wasn't. Suddenly, the thrusting stopped. He hadn't ejaculated. She was familiar enough with his rhythms to know that much. He pulled out of her, muttering something she couldn't quite make out, way up here in the safe zone. A moment later, his footsteps hurried away behind her, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing. Taka was alone with her body and her memories and the tiled creatures on the floor. Achilles had abandoned her. Something had distracted him. Maybe someone at the door. Maybe the voice of some other beast howling in his head. She was hearing a lot of those herself these days.
So, Taka's not having a great day. Not exactly having a good time. Not ideal.
But she at least understands where he's coming from a bit better, I suppose. Fire breathers. The airwaves seethed with tales of catastrophe. From Halifax to Houston, static field generators sparked and fried. Hospitals deep within the claves and fortresses on the very frontier flickered and blacked out. A report, a report from somewhere around Newark had an automated plastics refinery melting down. Another from Baffin Island claimed that a helium-3 cracking station was venting its isotopes uncontrollably into the atmosphere. It was almost as if the Maelstrom of old had been reborn, in all its world-spanning glory, but with 100 times the virulence. The Lenies were on the warpath, and suddenly they were hunting in groups. Firewalls crumbled in their path, exorcists engaged and were reduced to static on the spot. "Lifter just crashed into the Edmonton Spire," Clarke said. Lubin looked back at her. She tapped her ear, where his borrowed earbead relayed privileged chatter from the ether. "Half the city's on fire." "Let's hope ours is better behaved," Lubin said. Add that to your total score," she told herself, and tried to remember. This time it was different. Lives sacrificed now would be repaid 1,000-fold down the road. This was more than revenge. This was the greater good in all its glory. Remembering it was easy enough. Feeling right with it was something else again. This is what happens when you get Lenie to like Lenie. They were back on the coast, standing on the edge of some derelict waterfront in a ghost town whose name Clarke hadn't bothered to learn. All morning they had crept like black, blank-eyed spiders through this great junkscape of decaying metal. The dockside cranes, the loading elevators, the warehouses and dry docks, and other pre-millennial monstrosities of iron and corrugated steel. It was not a radio-friendly environment under the best conditions. And right here, the intermittent voices in Clarke's ear were especially thick with static. Which was, of course, the whole idea. So given they were coming from Freeport, my guess is they could be up around Bath, Maine, with Bath Ironworks. There's other locations it could be, some other ports, but that one has big ship manufacturing places. It's where things like the new Zumwalts and other such naval vessels get put together. To one side, a corroding warehouse with sheet metal skin and I-beam bones faced the water. To the other, 4 gantry cranes rose into the sky like a row of wireframe giraffes 60 meters high. They stood upright, their necks looming over the lip of the waterfront at a 70-degree angle. A great grasping claw dangled from each snout, poised to descend on freighters that had given up on this place decades before. A thin leash ran through a nose ring on the crane nearest the warehouse, a loop of braided polypropylene no thicker than a man's thumb. Both ends of that loop draped across empty space to a point partway up the neck of the second crane in line. There they had been tied off around a cervical girder. Against the backdrop of cables and superstructure, the rope looked as insubstantial as spider silk. Spider silk was what they'd been hoping for, actually. Surely, in this whole godforsaken industrial zone, somebody must have left some of the stuff behind. Spider rope had been a dirt-cheap commodity in the biotech age, but it had evidently grown a lot scarcer in the bioapocalyptic one. All they'd found was a coarse coil of antique plastic braid, hanging in an abandoned boathouse at the far end of the strip. Lubin had sighed and said it would have to do. Clarke had nearly passed out just watching him climb that leaning, precarious scaffold. The rope uncoiling in his wake, he'd wriggled up the first giraffe's throat and dangled head down like an ant from its eye socket, his legs wrapped around some spindly brace she was convinced would snap at any moment. She hadn't taken a complete breath until Lubin was safely on the ground again. Then she'd gone through the whole nerve-wracking experience all over again, as he climbed the second crane, carrying both ends of the rope this time. He'd stopped well short of the top, thank God, tying off the ends and leaving the rope looped between the structures like a nylon vine. Now, back on solid ground, he told her that she'd get better traction during her own climb if she wore. No fucking way, Clarke said. Not to the top, just to where the line's tied off. Halfway. That's more than halfway, and you know it. One slip and I'm sockeye. Not at all. The crane leans. You'll be dropping into the water. Yeah, from 50 meters? You think I... Wait a second. I'm supposed to drop into the water? That's the plan. Well, it's a really bad one. They'll be on guard as soon as they realize they've been decoyed. If they notice the rope at that point, it could be fatal. You'll untie it and pull it down with you. You'll be safe enough underwater. Forget it, Ken. It's just a rope, and your plan's so far into the oort that it would take another lunatic to figure it out even if he did see... Excuse me. She stopped herself. Lunatic might, after all, be a reasonable description of the man they were dealing with. For an instant, she was back on that scorched hulk off Sable, lifting her foot from a human rib cage. And Lubin had said, "Whoever's behind this is smarter than me." "I don't want to take any chances," he said now, softly. She tossed off a few more protests, but they both knew it was only theater. Eventually, she drove Miri to a safe distance and hiked back along the road while Lubin called in his report from the ultralight. A vector holed up in an abandoned warehouse, growing industrial quantities of seppuku in a basement lab. Control cabs nestled between the shoulder blades of each crane. Vandals or weather had long since knocked out most of the windows. Clarke and Lubin took cover there and waited. A faint whistle of rising wind sang through the framework above them. It came down from the sky like a bloated dragon, vented gas roaring from its trim bladders. The whirlwind heralded its... Sorry, the way the line gets broken there is kind of tricky. The whirlwind heralded its... Oh my god. I know what it says. My brain just refuses to say it. Give me a sec.
Oi.
It came down from the sky like a bloated dragon, vented gas roaring from its trim bladders. The whirlwind heralded its coming. A nor'easter had built throughout the day, and now it whistled across the waterfront with strength enough to drown voices. Sliding sheet metal doors caught the wind and tugged, clanging against their rollers. Thin stretched wires and massive cables rang and thrummed like hell's own string section. The lifter groaned and sparked down through the blow. It settled above the water, in front of the warehouse, and rotated to bring all its guns to bear. Lubin put his head next to Clarke's. Go! She followed him from the gutted cab. Within seconds, he was meters above her, sliding up through the Within seconds, he was meters above her, sliding up through the crane like an arboreal python. She gritted her teeth and climbed after. It wasn't as bad as she'd feared. A narrow ladder ran up the inside of the structure like a trachea, sprouting safety hoops at 1 meter intervals. But the wind buffeted on all sides, and surrounding girders sliced it into quarrelsome and unpredictable vortices. They pushed her against the ladder, twisted her sideways, slipped under her backpack and tried to yank it from her body. A sharp thunderclap from her left. She turned and froze and clung to the ladder for dear life. She hadn't realized how high she'd already climbed. The waterfront shuddered behind and beneath her. Not quite a tabletop model yet, but close enough. Too close. Far below, the harbor churned green and white. Another thunderclap. Not weather, though. The wind, for all its strength, howled beneath a blue and cloudless sky. That sound had come from the lifter. Seen from above, the vehicle looked like a great gunmetal jewel, faceted into concave triangles. skin sucked against geodesic ribs by the buoyant vacuum inside. It roared briefly above the wind, a hissing bellow of gaseous ballast. Its belly nearly touched the water. Its back curved higher than the warehouse roof, several stories above. Tame lightning, she remembered, for buoyancy control. High voltage arcs superheating trapped gases in the trim tanks. And Ken's going to ride this monster. Better him than me. She looked up. Lubin had reached his departure point and was untying one end of the rope, his legs wrapped around ambient scaffolding. He gestured impatiently at her, then staggered, knocked briefly off balance by a gust of wind. His hand shot out to steady himself on a nearby cable. She kept going, steadfastly refusing to look down again, no matter how many obscene noises the lifter made. She counted rungs. She counted girders and crossbeams and rivets as the wind howled in her ears and tugged at her limbs. She counted bare, steely patches where the red and yellow paint had sloughed away, until it reminded her that she was climbing a structure so ancient that its color wasn't even intrinsic to the material, but had been layered on as an afterthought. After a year or two, she was at Lubin's side, somewhere in the jet stream. Lubin was studying the lifter, the ubiquitous binocs clamped around his head. Clarke did not follow his gaze. One end of the rope was still tied firmly down. From that terminus it led out and up to the apex of the next crane, looped through whatever needle's eye Lubin had found up there, and stretched back to the final half-meter of polyprop. Yep, that is what it says. And stretched back to the final half-meter of polyprop now wrapped around his dive-skinned hand. A SATCAM, looking down on the tableau, would have seen two thin white lines pointing toward the lifter from their current roost. It would also have seen an ominously large, empty space between the point where the line ended and the point where the lifter began.
Are you sure it's long enough?
Clarke shouted. Lubin didn't answer. He probably hadn't heard the question through the wind and the skin of his hood. Clarke had barely heard herself. His tubular eyes stayed fixed on the target for a few more moments. Then he flipped the binocs up against his forehead.
They just deployed the teleop, he called.
The wind blew most of his decibels sideways and pitched in 50 of its own, but she got the gist. All according to plan, so far. The usual firestorm from on high wouldn't do the trick this time around. The hot zone Lubin had reported was too deep in the warehouse, too close to the waterline. It would take a free-moving teleop to scope the situation and personally deliver the flames, and local architecture hashed radio so badly that the little robot would have to stay virtually line of sight just to maintain contact with the mothership, which meant bringing the lifter down low. So low that a sufficiently motivated person might be able to drop onto it from above. Lubin had one arm hooked around a cable as thick as his wrist, one of the fraying metal tendons that kept the necks of the cranes upright. Now he unhooked his legs from their purchase and ducked under that cable, coming up on the other side. The outside. He was now hanging off the edge of the crane, not rattling about within it. He had one arm wrapped in polypropylene and the other hooked around the cable, his feet braced against a girder by nothing beyond his own weight. Suddenly, Ken Lubin looked very fragile indeed. His mouth moved. Clarke heard nothing but wind.
What?
He leaned back toward the structure, enunciating each syllable.
You know what to do.
She nodded. She couldn't believe he was actually going to go through with this.
Good luck,
she began, and staggered, flailing, as the hand of an invisible giant slapped her sideways. She grasped out, blindly, at anything. Her hands closed on nothing. Something hard cracked against the back of her head, bounced her forward again. A girder rushed by to her right. She caught it and hung on for dear life. She looked around. Where... Whoops, Ken? She looked around. Where Lubin's face and chest had been, there was nothing but howling space. His forearm was still wrapped around the cable, though, like a black grappling hook. She lowered her gaze a fraction. There was the rest of him, scrabbling for purchase and finding it. Regaining his balance in the gale, pulling himself back up, that fucking plastic rope still wound around one hand. The wind slacked for the briefest moment. Lubin ducked back into the wireframe cage. "You okay?" she asked as the wind rose again, and saw in the next instant the blood on his face. He leaned in close. "Change of plans," he said, and struck her forearm with the edge of his free hand. Clarke yelped, her grip broken. She fell. Lubin caught her, pulled her abruptly sideways. Her shoulder slammed against metal and twisted. Suddenly, the crane wasn't around her anymore. It was beside her. "Hang on," Lubin growled against her cheek. They were airborne. George, George, George of the jungle, friend to you and me. Alternatively, do your best Tarzan holler. And so on and so forth. She was far too petrified to scream. For endless seconds they were in free fall. The world rushed toward them like a fly swatter. Then Lubin's arm tightened around her waist, and some new force pulled them off center into a sweeping arc that only amended gravity at first, then defied it outright. They swooped down over whitecaps and churning flotsam, and she seemed to grow kilograms heavier. Then they were rising again, miraculously, the wind catching them from behind. The colossal squashed spheroid of the lifter loomed above and then ahead of them, and then below, its numberless polygons reflecting like the facets of some great compound eye. And then they were dropping again, through an invisible tingling barrier that scratched sparks across her face, and Clarke barely put her hands out in time to break the fall. Ow! They were on a steep slope, facing uphill. She lay on her stomach, hands splayed forward, in a triangular depression perhaps 3 meters on a side. Her dive skin squirmed like a torture victim. Lubin lay half on top of her, half to one side, his right arm pressed into the small of her back. Some defiantly functional module in her brain realized that he'd probably kept her from rolling off the edge of the world. The rest of her gulped air in great whooping breaths that played, "I'm alive! I'm alive! I'm alive! I'm alive!" on infinite loop. "You all right?" Lubin's voice was low but audible. The wind still pushed at their backs, but it seemed suddenly vague, diffuse. "What?" Tiny electric shocks prickled her tongue and lips when she tried to speak. She tried to slow her breathing. "What the fuck are you—" "I'll take that as a yes." He lifted his hand from her back. "Keep low, climb up the slope. We're far too close to the edge of this thing." He clambered away uphill. She lay in the depression, the pit in her own stomach infinitely deeper. She felt ominously lightheaded. She put one hand to her temple. Her hair was sticking straight out from her scalp as if her head had its own personal Van Allen belt. Her dive skin crawled. These things have static fields, she realized. Taka had talked about cancer. Finally, her heart slowed to jackhammer rhythm. Finally, her heart slowed to jackhammer rhythm. She forced herself to move. She squirmed on her belly past the lip of the first polygon and into the concavity of the second. At least the ridges between provided a foothold against the slope. The grade lessened with each meter. Before too long, she dared to crouch, and then to stand upright. The wind blew harder against chest than legs, some kind of distance cubed thing going on with the static field. But even against her head, it wasn't as strong as it had been up in the crane. It blew her levitating hair into her face every time she turned around, but she barely noticed that inconvenience next to the ongoing convulsions of her dive skin. Lubin was kneeling near the lifter's north pole, on a smooth circular island in a sea of triangles. The island was about 4 meters across, and its topography ranged from thumbnail-sized fiber-op sockets to hatches the size of manhole covers. Lubin had already got one of those open. By the time Clarke reached him, he'd put whatever safe-cracking tools he'd used back into his pack.
Ken, what the fuck is going on?
He wiped blood from his cheek with the back of one hand.
I changed my mind. I need you along after all.
But what?
Seal up.
He pointed at the open hatch. Dark, viscous liquid lapped in the opening, like blood or machine oil.
I'll explain everything once we're inside.
What? In there? Will our implants even work?
Now, Lenie, no time.
Clarke pulled up her hood. It wriggled disquietingly on her scalp. At least it kept her hair from flying everywhere.
What about the rope?
She said, suddenly remembering. She said suddenly, space, remembering. There we go. Not the other way around. Lubin stopped in the middle of sealing his face flap. He glanced back at the gantry cranes. A fine white thread lashed back and forth from the nearest, a whip in the wind.
Can't be helped, he said. Get in.
Viscous, total darkness.
Can.
Machine voice, vocoder voice. It had been a while.
Yes.
What are we breathing?
Flamethrower fuel.
What?
It's perfectly safe. You'd be dead otherwise.
But,
It doesn't have to be water. Hydroxyl groups contain oxygen.
yeah, but they built us for water. I can't believe napalm.
It's not napalm.
Whatever it is, it's got to gum up our implants somewhere down the road.
Down the road isn't an issue. We'll be fine if they last for a few more hours.
Will they?
Yes.
At least her dive skin had stopped moving. A sudden tug of inertia.
What's that?
She buzzed, alarmed.
Fuel feed. They're firing.
And what? There wasn't any hot zone.
Maybe they're just being cautious.
Or maybe Seppuku was really there all along and we didn't know it.
He didn't answer.
Ken?
It's possible.
The surge had pushed her against something soft and slippery and vaguely flexible. It seemed to extend in all directions. It was too smooth to get any kind of a grip. They weren't in a tank, she realized. They were in a bladder. It didn't just empty, it deflated. It collapsed.
Ken, when this thing fires, could we get sucked out into...
No. There's a grill.
Vocoders stripped most of the feeling out of a voice at the best of times, and this syrupy stuff didn't improve performance. Any. Still, she got the sense that Lubin didn't want to talk. As if Ken's ever been king of the extroverts. But no, there was something else. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. So she floated there in amniotic darkness, breathing something that wasn't napalm, and remembered that electrolysis involved tiny electrical sparks. She waited and wondered if one of them would ignite the liquid passing through her and around her, wondered if her implants were about to turn this whole lifter into an airborne fireball. Another victim of the Lennies, she mused, and smiled to herself. But then she remembered that Lubin still hadn't told her why she was here. And then she remembered the blood on his face. In kind. By the time they reached their destination, Lubin was blind. The frayed cable on the crane hadn't just gashed his face, it had torn his hood. The lifter's incendiary saliva had seeped through that tear before the dive skin could heal. It had diffused across his face. A thin layer had pooled beneath his eye caps, corroding his corneas down to pitted jelly. A calm, mechanical voice in the darkness had told Clarke what he expected, the ability to tell light from dark, at least. The ability to tell light from dark, at least. Perhaps some vestigial perception of fuzzy blobs and shadows. The resolution of actual images was very unlikely. He would need her to be his eyes.
Jesus Christ, Ken, why did you do it? I gambled. You what? We could hardly have stayed on top of the lifter. There are sterilization measures even if the wind didn't blow us off, and I wasn't certain how corrosive this... Why didn't we just walk away, regroup, do it again later? Later, we could well be incapacitated, assuming your friend is still contagious. Not to mention the fact that I filed a false report and haven't called in since. Desjardins knows something's wrong. The more we delay, the more time he has to prepare. I think that's bullshit. I think you've just got such a hard-on for getting back at him that you're making stupid decisions. You're entitled to your opinion. If I had to assess my own performance lately, I'd say a worse decision was not leaving you back on the ridge. Right, Ken. Achilles had me on a leash for the past 2 weeks. I was the one who read Seppuku ass backwards. Jesus, man, you've been sitting on the bottom of the ocean for 5 years just like the rest of us. You're not exactly at the top of your game.
Silence.
Ken, what are we going to do? You're blind. There are ways around that.
Eventually, he said they'd docked. She didn't know how he could tell, the sloshing of liquid that contained them, perhaps, some subtle inertia below Clarke's own perceptual threshold. Certainly no sound had tipped him off. Buried deep in the lifter's vacuum, the bladder was as quiet as outer space. They crept out onto the back of the beast. It had come to rest in an enormous hangar with a clamshell roof whose halves were sliding shut above them. It was deep dusk, judging from the opacity of the sky beyond. The lifter sloped away in all directions, a tiny faceted planet, birthing them from its north pole. Light and machine sounds came from below, and an occasional human voice, but these upper reaches were all grayscale. "What do you see?" Lubin said in a low voice. She turned and caught her breath. He'd peeled back his hood and removed his eye caps. The gray of his skin was far too dark and pebbled with blisters. His exposed eyes were clusters of insectile compound bumps. Iris and pupil were barely visible behind, as if seen through chipped, milky glass. "Well?" We're indoors," she told him. "Nobody in sight, and it's probably too dark for drybacks to see us up here anyway. I can't see the factory floor, but it sounds like there are people down there. Are you... Fuck, Ken, did it?" "Just the face. The skin sealed off everything else." "Does it... how do you... There's a gantry on an overhead rail to the left. See it?" She forced herself to look away. Yeah. And then, surprised, can you?
The guts show up on my inlays. This whole hangar is a wireframe schematic. He looked around as if sighted. That assembly's on autopilot. I think it handles refueling.
The clamshell doors met overhead with a dull, echoing boom. In the next instant, the gantry jerked to life and began sliding toward them along its rail. A pair of Waldos unfolded like the forelimbs of a mantis. They ended in clawed nozzles. I think you're right, Clarke said.
I see it.
How do we get out of here? He turned his blind, pitted eyes on her. He pointed at the approaching arthropod.
Climb, he said.
He guided her through rafters and crawlways as though born to them. He quizzed her on the color coding of overhead pipes, or which side of a given service tunnel was more streaked with the stains of old condensation. They found their way into an uninhabited locker room, traversed a gauntlet of lockers and toilet stalls to an open shower. They washed down. No longer flammable, they turned their attention to blending in. Lubin had brought dryback clothing wadded up in his backpack. Clarke had to make do with a pair of gray coveralls lifted from a row of a half-dozen hanging along one wall. A bank of lockers lined the wall opposite, locked with snapshots and thumb pads. Lubin made a mockery of their security while Clarke dressed. The weave tightened around her into a reasonable approximation of a good fit. What are you looking for? She asked.
Sunglasses. Visor, maybe.
4 jimmied lockers later, Lubin gave up. They returned to the echoing arena of the main hangar. They walked brazenly across open space in plain view of 8 service techs. They passed beneath the swollen bellies of 4 lifters, and gaping bays that would have held another 3. They wound along rows of clicking, articulated machinery, waving casually across the floor at people in blue coveralls, and, at Lubin's insistence, keeping a discreet distance from others wearing gray. They found an exit. Outside, the buildings were packed so closely that their upper floors seemed to lean together. Arches and skywalks spanned the narrow airspace above the street, connecting opposing facades like stretched arteries. In other places, the buildings themselves had melded at the 5th floor or the 40th, overhanging bowls of plastic and biosteel fusing one structure to another. The sky was visible only in dark fragments, intermittently sparking with static electricity. The street was a spaghetti of rapid trans rails and narrow sidewalks, doubling as loading platforms. Neither rails nor walkways carried much traffic. Colors were a muted wash to Clarke's eyes. Drybacks could see intermittent pools of dim copper light, and many deep shadows between. Even in these relict nodes of civilization, energy seemed in short supply. Ken Lubin would be seeing none of the surfaces. Perhaps he saw the wiring underneath. She found them a market in the shadow of a 3rd-story overhang. Half the machines were offline, but the menu on the Levi's dispenser twinkled invitingly. Lubin suggested that she trade up from coveralls. He offered his wristwatch to enable the transaction, but the machine sensed the long-forgotten currency chip embedded in Clarke's thigh, still packed with unspent pay from her gig at the Grid Authority. It lasered her for fit, while Lubin got a pair of nightshades and a tube of skin cream from a Johnson & Johnson a few stalls down. Why is my embouchure doing this? Let's try that paragraph again. Sorry. I'm better than this. She found them a market in the shadow of a 3rd-story overhang. Half the machines were offline, but the menu on the Levi's dispenser twinkled invitingly. Lubin suggested that she trade up from the coveralls. He offered his wristwatch. to enable the transaction, but the machine sensed the long-forgotten currency chip embedded in Clarke's thigh, still packed with unspent pay from her gig at the Grid Authority. It lasered her for a fit, while Lubin got a pair of nightshades and a tube of skin cream from a Johnson & Johnson a few stalls down. She pulled on her new clothing while Lubin whispered into his wristwatch. Clarke couldn't tell whether he was talking to software or flesh and blood. She gathered from his end of the conversation that they were in the northern core of Toro Milton. Afterward, they had places to go. They climbed from the floor of the city into a mountainous range of skyscrapers. Office buildings mostly, long since converted to dormitories for those who'd been able to buy their way out of the burbs when the field generators went up. There weren't many people abroad up there either. Perhaps the citizenry didn't come out at night. She was a seeing eye dog, helping her master hunt for Easter eggs. He directed her. She led him. Lubin muttered incessantly into his watch as they moved. His incantations catalyzed the appearance of strange objects in unlikely places. A seamless box barely bigger than a handpad, nestled in the plumbing of a public toilet. A brand-new wristwatch, still in the original packaging, on the floor of an elevator that rose past the mezzanine with no one on board. Lubin left his old watch in its place, along with a tiny ziplock of derms and plug-ins from his own inventory. At a vending wall on the same level, he ordered a roll of semi-permeable adhesive tape and a cloned ham and cheese. The tape was served up without incident, but no sandwich appeared on its heels. Instead, a pair of hand-sized containers slid down the chute, flattened opalescent cylinders with rounded edges. He popped one of them open to reveal pince nez. There we go. With opaque jade lenses. He set them on his nose. His jaw twitched slightly as he reset some dental switch. A tiny green star winked on at the edge of the left lens. Pince nez, however that's pronounced, pince nez, is the small glasses that don't have side bits that go over your ear. They pinch your nose. It's literally in the name. So one gets an image of smaller glasses, slightly smaller, tiny shades, like what Jean Reno had going in The Professional. Anton the Professional is what I envision. Perhaps that is wrong. Except not as much beard. Probably not as much gravitas as Jean Reno, to be honest. He tries. Ken Lubin tries. Better. He looked around. Depth perception's not all it could be. Nice trick, Clarke said. It talks to your inlays? More or less. The image is a bit grainy. Now Lubin took the lead. There's no easier way to do this? She asked him, following. You couldn't just call up the GA head office? I doubt I'm still on their payroll. He turned left at a T-junction. Yeah, but don't you have... They stopped replenishing the field caches some time ago, Lubin said. I'm told any leftovers have long since been acquired by unilaterals. Everything has to be negotiated through contacts. You're buying them off? Morpheus had pince nez. That's an even better example. That's a movie everyone's seen. As opposed to Anton the Professional? Victor the Professional with Jean Reno. Whatever it's called. It's his name, then The Professional. I can't remember now. Which maybe not as many people have seen. Had, what's her face in it? I think it was an extremely young Natalie Portman. Extremely young. Like young. Like a child. Young teenager. Anyway. Movie commentary aside. You're buying them off? It's not a question of money. What then? Barter, he said. An old debt or two. In-kind services. At 2200, they met a man who pulled a gossamer fine thread of fiber op from his pocket and plugged it into Lubin's new wristwatch. Lubin stood there for over half an hour, motionless except for the occasional twitching of fingers. A statue leaning slightly into some virtual wind, as if poised to pounce on empty air. Afterward, the stranger reached up and touched the blisters on Lubin's face. Lubin laid one brief hand on the other man's shoulder. The interaction was subtly disquieting, for reasons Clarke couldn't quite put her finger on. She tried to remember the last time she'd seen Ken Lubin touch another person short of violence or duty, and failed. Leon the Professional, that's the one! Thank you. Thank you, Warren Steele and Uber Bobby Draws. I appreciate it. My memory on the spot isn't always perfect. She tried to remember the last time she'd seen Ken Lubin touch another person short of violence or duty, and failed. Who was that? She asked afterward. No one. And contradicting himself in the next second, someone to spread the word, although there's no guarantee that even he can raise the alarm in time. At 2307, Lubin knocked at a door in a residential retrofit in the middle reaches of what had once been the Toronto Dominion Centre. A brown-skinned, grim-faced ectomorph of a woman answered. Her eyes blazed a startling, almost luminous golden orange, some kind of cultured xanthophil in the irises, and she loomed over Lubin by a head or more. She spoke quietly in a strange language full of consonants, every syllable thick with anger. Lubin answered in the same tongue, and held out a sealed ziplock. The woman snatched it, reached behind the half-open door, threw a bag at his feet. It landed with the muffled clank of gloved metal, and closed the door in his face. He stowed the bag in his backpack. What did she give you? Clarke asked. Ordnance. He started back down the hall. What did you give her? He shrugged. An antidote. Just before midnight, they entered a great vaulted space that might once have been the centerpiece of a mall. Now its distant ceiling was eclipsed by a warren on stilts, a great mass of prefab squats and storage cubes held together by a maze of improvised scaffolding. It was a more efficient use of space than the extravagant emptiness of the old days, if a whole lot uglier. The bottom of the retrofit stood maybe 4 meters off the original marbled floor. Occasional ladders reached down through its underside to ground level. Dark seams cracked the structure here and there, narrow gaps in a patchwork quilt of plastic and fiber paneling, a bounty of peepholes for hidden eyes. Clarke thought she heard the rustling of large animals in hiding, the occasional quiet murmur of muffled voices, but she and Lubin seemed to be the only ones here on the floor beneath. Sudden motion to the left. A great fountain had once decorated the center of this place. These days its broad soapstone basin, spread out in the perpetual shadow of the squat, seemed to serve primarily as a community dumpster. Pieces of a woman were detaching themselves from that backdrop. The illusion was far from perfect, now that Clarke focused on it. The chromatophores on the woman's unitard mimicked her background in broad strokes at best, producing more of a blurry translucence than outright invisibility. Not that this particular K seemed to care about camouflage. The ambulatory hair wasn't exactly designed to blend with the background. She approached them like a fuzzy cloud with body parts attached. "You must be Kenny," she said to Lubin. "I'm Laurel. Yuri said you had skin problems." She gave Clarke an appraising glance, blinking over pupils slit subtly vertical. "Like the eyes. Takes balls to go for Rifter chic in these parts." Clarke looked back expressionlessly. After a moment, Laurel turned back to Lubin. "Yuri's wait—" Lubin snapped her neck. Laurel sagged bonelessly into his arms, her head lolling.
Fuck, Ken!
Clarke staggered back as if she'd been kicked in the stomach.
What are you...
From the rustling cliff dwellings above them, sudden silence. Lubin had Laurel laid out on her back, his pack at her side. Her cat eyes stared up at the belly of the squat, wide and astonished.
Ken!
I told you in-kind services might be necessary. He fished a hand grip of some kind from his pack, pressed a stud on its hilt. A thin blade snicked into view. It hummed. One stroke and Laurel's unitard was split from crotch to throat. The elastic fabric pulled apart like slashed mesentery. Sorry. The elastic fabric pulled apart like slashed mesentery. Chat, snap, sag, just like that. It was impossible to banish the image. Deep abdominal cut, right side. No blood. A wisp of blue smoke curled up from the incision. It carried the scent of cauterizing flesh. Clarke looked around frantically. There was still no one else in sight, but it felt as though 1,000 eyes were on them. It felt as though the whole teetering structure over their heads was holding its breath, as though it might collapse on them at any second. Lubin plunged his hand into Laurel's side. There was no hesitation, no exploratory poke and prod. He knew exactly where he was going. Whatever he was after must be showing up on his inlays. Laurel's eyes turned in her head. They stared at Lenie Clarke.
Oh, God, she's alive!
She can't feel it,
Lubin said. How could he do this? Clarke wondered. And an instant later, after all these years, how could I still be surprised?
Lubin's blood-soaked hand came back into sight. Something pea-sized glistened like a pearl in the clotting gore between thumb and forefinger. A child began crying somewhere in the warren overhead. Lubin lifted his face to the sound.
Witnesses, Ken.
He stood. Laurel lay bleeding out at his feet, her eyes still fixed on Clarke.
They're used to it.
He started walking.
Come on.
She backed away a few steps. Laurel stared steadily at the place where Lenie Clarke had been.
No time,
Lubin called over his shoulder. Clarke turned and fled after him. Lawrence Steele says the mesentery is a fold of membrane that attaches the intestine to the wall around the stomach area and holds it in place. Thanks, Google.
Oh, that's horrifying.
That's about right. That's contextually accurate. I now have the mental image permanently burned on my brain. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Peter Watts.
Island Airport pushed up against the southern reaches of the static dome. There was no island that Clarke could see, only a low, broad building with helicopters and ultralights scattered across its roof. Either there was no security or Lubin's negotiations had seduced it. They walked unaccosted to a 4-seater Sikorsky Bell, outfitted with passive cloaking. The pearl shucked from Laurel's guts proved to be the keys to its heart. Toro Milton dimmed in the distance behind them. They flew north beneath the sight of some hypothetical radar, threading between silver-gray treetops. Darkness and photocollagen hid a multitude of sins. For all Clarke knew, every plant, every rock, every square meter of the landscape below was coated in Behemoth. You couldn't tell through the photoamps, though. The terrain scrolling past was frosted and beautiful. Occasional lakes slid beneath them like great puddles of mercury, dimly radiant. She didn't mention the view to Lubin. She didn't know if his prosthetic eyes came equipped with night vision, but he'd switched them off anyway. At least, the little green LED was dark. Nav must be talking directly to his inlays. She didn't know she was carrying it, Clarke said. They were the first words she'd spoken since Laurel's eyes had fixed and dilated.
No, Yuri made her a home-cooked meal.
He wanted her dead.
Evidently.
Clarke shook her head. Laurel's eyes wouldn't leave her alone. But why that way? Why put it inside her?
I suspect he didn't trust me to keep up my end of the deal.
The corner of Lubin's mouth twitched slightly.
Rather elegant solution, actually.
So someone thought that Ken Lubin might be reluctant to commit murder. It should have been a cause for hope. For the keys to a helicopter, Clarke said. I mean, couldn't we just...
Just what, Lenny? He snapped. Fall back on all those high-level contacts that I used to have? Call the rental agency? Has it still not dawned on you that a continental hot zone and 5 years of martial law might have had some impact on intercity travel?
Lubin shook his head.
Or perhaps you don't think we're giving Desjardins enough time to set up his defenses. Perhaps we should just walk the distance to give him a sporting chance.
She'd never heard him talk like this before. It was as if some chess grandmaster, renowned for icy calm, had suddenly cursed and kicked over the board in the middle of a game. They flew in silence for a while. I can't believe it's really him, she said at last.
I don't see why not.
Lubin was back in battle computer mode.
We know he lied about Seppuku.
Maybe he made an honest mistake. Taka's an actual MD, and she even...
It's him,
Lubin said. She didn't push it. Where are we going? She asked.
Sudbury. Evidently, he didn't want to give up home field advantage.
It wasn't destroyed during Rio?
Desjardins caused Rio.
What? Who told you that?
I know the man. It makes sense.
Not to me.
Desjardins was the first to slip the leash. He had a brief window in which he was the only man on the planet with all the power of a lawbreaker and none of the constraints. He used it to eliminate the competition before Spartacus freed them.
But it wasn't just Sudbury. Rio took out cities all over. She remembered words and images streaming across the Atlantic. An industrial lifter inexplicably crashing into the CSIRA tower in Salt Lake. A fast neutron bomb in the unlikely hands of the Daughters of Lenie. Quantum shriekers falling from orbit onto Sacramento and Boise.
Sudbury wouldn't have been the only franchise seeded, Lubin pointed out. Desjardins must have obtained the list and gone to town.
And blamed it on Rio, Clarke murmured.
All the post hoc evidence pointed there. Of course, the city was vaporized before anyone had a chance to ask questions. Very little forensic evidence survives ground zero.
Lubin tapped a control icon.
As far as anyone knew at the time, Desjardins saved the day. He was the toast of the town. At least he was the toast of anyone with high enough clearance to know who he was.
There was a subtext to the aridity in Lubin's voice. His clearance had been revoked by then. But he couldn't have got everyone, Clarke said.
He didn't have to. Only those infected with Spartacus. That would have been a minority even in seeded franchises, assuming he hit them early enough.
There'd still be people off shift, people off sick.
Wipe out half a city, you get them too.
Still...
You're right, to a point, Lubin allowed. It's likely some escaped. But even that worked in Desjardins' favor. He can't very well blame Rio for his actions now. He can't blame everything on Madonna's, but as long as convenient scapegoats from Rio or Topeka are at large, nobody's likely to suspect him when some piece of a high-level sabotage comes to light. He saved the world, after all.
She sighed. So, what now?
We go get him.
Just like that, huh? Blind Spy and his rookie sidekick are going to battle their way through 65 floors of CSIRA security?
Assuming we can get there. He's likely to have all approaches under continuous satellite surveillance. He must have planned for the word getting out eventually, which means he'll be equipped to handle large-scale retaliation up to and including missile attacks from overseas. Far more than we can muster.
He thinks he can take on the rest of the world?
More likely, he only expects to see the rest of the world coming in time to get away. More likely, he only expects to see the rest of the world coming in time to get away.
There we go. So is that your plan? He's expecting an all-out assault so he won't notice one measly helicopter?
That would be nice, Lubin admitted with a grim smile. I'm not counting on it. And even if he doesn't notice us on approach, he's had nearly 4 years to fill the building up with countermeasures. It would probably be impossible for us to guard against them all, even if I knew what they were.
So, what do we do?
I'm still working on the details. I expect we'll end up walking through the front door.
Clarke looked at his fingernails. The dried blood beneath turned their edges brown. You've put all the pieces together, she said. They make him a monster.
Aren't we all?
He wasn't. Do you even remember? Lubin didn't answer. You were going to kill me, remember? And I'd just killed everyone else. We were the monsters, Ken. And you remember what he did?
Yes.
He tried to save me. From you. He'd never even met me face to face, and he knew exactly who I was and what I'd done, and he knew firsthand what you were capable of. And it didn't matter. He risked his life to save mine.
I remember.
Lubin tweaked controls.
You broke his nose.
That's not the point.
That person doesn't exist anymore, he said. Spartacus turned him into something else.
Yeah? And what did it do to you, Ken? His blind, pitted face turned.
I know one thing it didn't do.
I know one thing it didn't do, she went on. It didn't give you your murder habit. You had that all along, didn't you? The pince-nez stared back at her like mantis eyes. A green LED ignited on its left lens. What's it like, Ken? Is it cathartic? Is it sexual? Does it get you off? A part of her looked on, alarmed. The rest couldn't stop goading him. Do you have to be right there, watching us die? Or is it enough to just plant the bomb and know we'll be dropping like flies off stage?
Lenny.
His voice was very calm.
What exactly are you trying to accomplish?
I just want to know what you're after, that's all. I don't see anyone waving pitchforks and torches at you just because Spartacus rewired your brain. If you're sure about this, if he really did all these things, and he's really some kind of monster, then fine. But if this is just some fucked up excuse for you to indulge your perverse little fetish, then... She shook her head in disgust and glared into the darkness.
You'd like his perversion somewhat less than mine, Lubin said quietly.
Right, she snorted. Thanks for the input.
Lenny.
What?
I'm never gratuitous, he told her.
Really? She looked a challenge at him. Never? He looked back.
Well, hardly ever.
Ladies and gentlemen, comedy! The great Lenny and Kenny comedy duo.
Badum-tish.
Expiration date!
Equal parts dead and alive, and hardly caring which way the balance went, Taka Willette had figured it out. She'd never done well under pressure. That had always been her problem. And Achilles, the monster, hadn't understood that. Or maybe he'd understood it too well. Whatever. He had put her under the mother of all high-pressure scenarios, and of course she'd fallen apart. She'd proven once again to be the eternal fuck-up. And it was so unfair because she knew she had a good head on her shoulders. She knew she could figure things out if only people would stop leaning on her. If only Ken hadn't been there with his biowar canister, expecting answers right now. If only Achilles hadn't come within a hair of incinerating her alive, and then rushing her through Seppuku's gene sequence without so much as letting her catch her breath. If only Dave hadn't been so impatient. If only she hadn't hurried on that last crucial diagnostic. She was a smart lady. She knew it. But she was terrible under pressure. Bad, bad Alice, she chided herself. But now that the pressure was off, see how well she put everything together? It had only taken two things to get her over the hump. Achilles had to leave her alone for a bit, give her a chance to think. And she had to die. Well, start dying, anyway. Once she knew she was dead, once she felt it in her bones, no reprieves, no last-minute rescue, all the pressure disappeared. For the first time in her life, it seemed, she could think clearly. She didn't know how long it had been since Achilles had been by to torture her. She figured at least a day or two, maybe a week, but no, surely she'd be dead already if he'd left her here for a whole week. Her joints had frozen up in the meantime. Even if she were to be released from the exoskeleton, her body was as rigid as rigor. Maybe it was rigor. Maybe she'd already finished dying and hadn't noticed. Certainly, things didn't seem to hurt as much as they had, although maybe she just didn't notice the pain so much now, on account of the raging thirst. One thing you could say about Achilles, he'd always kept her fed and watered. Didn't want her too weak to perform, he'd said. But it had been so very long since he'd come by. Taka would have killed for a glass of water if she hadn't already died for want of one. But wasn't it nice that nothing mattered anymore? And wasn't it nice that she'd actually figured it out? She wished that Achilles would come back, not just for the water, although that would be nice. She wanted to show him. She wanted to prove he was wrong. She wanted him to be proud of her. It all had to do with that silly little song about the fleas. He must have known that. That's why he'd serenaded her in the first place. Has smaller fleas that on him prey, and these have smaller still to bite 'em. Life within life. She could see it now. She was amazed that she'd never seen it before. It wasn't even a new concept. It was downright old. Mitochondria were littler fleas that lived in every eukaryotic cell. Today they were vital organelles, the biochemical batteries of life itself, the powerhouse of the cell. Sorry. Where were we? Oh, yes, but 1 billion years ago they'd been independent organisms in their own right. Little free-living bacteria. A larger cell had engulfed them, had forgotten to chew before it swallowed. And so they'd struck up a deal, the big cell and the little one. The big cell would provide a safe, stable environment. The little one, in turn, would pump out energy for its host. That ancient act of failed predation had turned into the primordial symbiosis. And even today, mitochondria kept their own genes, reproduced on their own schedule, within the flesh of their host. It was still going on. Behemoth itself had stuck up a similar. I think that's supposed to be struck up. Behemoth itself had struck up a similar relationship within the cells of some of the creatures that shared its deep-sea environment, providing an energy surplus which the host fish used to grow faster. It grew within the cells of things here on land, too, with somewhat less than beneficial consequences, true, but then virulence is always high when two radically disparate organisms encounter each other for the first time. Achilles hadn't been singing about fleas at all. He'd been singing about endosymbiosis. Seppuku must carry its own little fleas. There was more than enough room. All those redundant genes could code for any number of viral organisms, as well as merely masking the suicidal recessives. Seppuku not only killed itself off when its job was done, it gave birth to a new symbiont, a viral one probably, that would take up residence inside the host cell. It would fill the niche so effectively that Behemoth would find nothing but no vacancy signs if it came sniffing around afterward, looking to move back in. There were even precedents of a sort. Taka remembered some of them from med school. Malaria had been beaten when baseline mosquitoes lost out to a faster breeding variant that didn't transmit plasmodium. AIDS stopped being a threat when benign strains outnumbered lethal ones. Those were nothing, though, diseases that attacked a handful of species at most. Behemoth threatened everything with a nucleus. You could never beat the witch by infecting the human race, or replacing one species of insect with another. The only way to win against Behemoth would be to counter-infect everything. Seppuku would have to redesign life itself from the inside out. And it could do it, too. It had an edge on that poor old Behemoth. It had an edge that poor old Behemoth had never even dreamed of. Achilles had forced her to remember that, too, half an eternity ago. TNA could duplex with modern nucleic cells. It could talk to the genes of its host cell. It could join the genes of its host cell. It could change anything and everything. If she was right, and hovering at the edge of her life, she'd never been more certain of anything, Seppuku was more than a cure for Behemoth. It was the most profound evolutionary leap since the rise of the eukaryotic cell. It was a solution far too radical for the fiddlers and tweakers who hadn't been able to see beyond the old paradigm of life as we know it. The deep-sea enzymes, the arduous, painstaking retrofits that had allowed Taka and others like her to claim immunity. Improvised scaffolding, no more. Struts and crutches to keep some teetering body plan alive long after its expiration date. People had grown too attached to the chemical tinker toys that had defined them for 3 billion years. The most nostalgia could ever do was postpone the inevitable. Seppuku's architects were more radical. They'd thrown away the old cellular specs entirely and started from scratch. They were rewiring the very chemistry of life. Every eukaryotic species would be changed at the molecular scale. No wonder Seppuku's creators had kept it under wraps. You didn't have to be an M&M to be terrified by such an extreme solution. People always chose the devils they knew, even if that devil was Behemoth. People just wouldn't accept that success couldn't be achieved through just a little more tinkering. Taka could barely imagine the shape of the success that was unfolding now. Perhaps the strange new insects she'd been seeing were the start of it. Fast, short lives that evolved through dozens of generations in a season. Achilles hadn't been able to keep it out after all. Those joyful, monstrous bugs proved it. He had only been able to keep it from infecting humanity. And even there, he was doomed to fail. Salvation would take root in everything eventually, as it had taken root in the arthropods. It would just take more time for creatures who lived at a slower pace. Our turn will come, Taka thought. How would it work? She wondered. How to outcompete the hyper-competitor? Brute force, perhaps? Sheer cellular voracity? The same scramble competition strategy that Behemoth had used to beat Life 1.0, turned back upon itself? Would life burn twice as bright and half as long? Would the whole biosphere move faster, think faster, live furiously and briefly as mayflies? But that was the old paradigm, to transform yourself into your enemy and then claim victory. There were other options, once you gave up on reinforcing and turned to redesign instead. Taka Woolette Oulette, mediocre progeny of the old guard, couldn't begin to guess at what they were. She doubted anyone could. What simulation could predict the behavior of a multi-million species system when every living variable was perturbed at once? How many carefully selected experimental treatments would it take to model a billion simultaneous mutations? Seppuku, whatever Seppuku was poised to become, threw the very concept of a controlled experiment right out the window. North America was the experiment, unannounced, uncontrolled, an inconceivably tangled matrix of multi-way ANOVAs and hyper-niche tables. Even if it failed, the world would hardly be worse off. Behemoth would have suffered a major setback, Seppuku would have fallen on its sword, and whatever came after would at least, unlike Behemoth, be limited to the inside of a host cell. And maybe it wouldn't fail. Maybe everything would change for the better. There would be monsters, some hopeful. Mitochondria themselves might finally be driven to extinction. Their ancient lease expired at last. Maybe people would change from the inside out, the old breed gone, replaced by something that looked the same but acted better. Maybe it was about fucking time. A little man nattered at her from a great distance. He stood in front of her, an irritating homunculus in ultra-sharp focus, as if seen through the wrong end of a telescope. He paced back and forth, gesticulating madly. Taka gathered that he was afraid of something, or someone. Yes, that was it. Someone was coming for him. He spoke as if his head was full of voices, as if he had lost control of a great many things at once. He threatened her. She thought he was threatening her, although his efforts seemed almost comical. He sounded like a lost little boy trying to act brave while looking for a place to hide.
I figured it out,
Taka told him. Her voice cracked like cheap, brittle plastic. She wondered why that was.
It wasn't so hard.
But he was too caught up in his own little world. It didn't matter. He didn't seem like the kind of person who'd really appreciate the dawn of a new age anyway. So many things were about to happen. The end of life as we knew it. The beginning of life as we don't. It had already started. Her biggest regret was that she wouldn't be around to see how it all turned out.
Dave, honey, she thought, I did it. I got it right at last. You'd be proud of me.
And that is where we will call it. Next week, the thrilling climax of Behemoth, Book 2, Seppuku, by Peter Watts, as well as acknowledgments and the afterword. Alrighty. With that, we're going to call it. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. If you didn't tune in and you're watching, listening, whatever, to this after the fact, hi. I do these live every Friday on Free Read Fridays, starting at about noon Eastern Standard Time, where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. Alrighty. With that, so if you want to catch me live, you can go ahead. Otherwise, I will have, as of this weekend, I will get the playlists and everything up to date and set. I'm probably just going to put these into the same Behemoth playlist as the other Behemoth ones and not have a separate playlist. I don't remember if I already did that or not. That's what I think I'll wind up doing, just for simplicity. Other than that, stay safe, stay sane. Don't let all the wildfire smoke get you down, and be decent to each other. Alrighty. Until next time. Bye.